don't worry. For that, we're going to go right into it. I thought we were doing a main stage and I was going to do one presentation and we had all this time. So I didn't realize it's done in this format. So kind of rushing through this. All right. Most of you, I believe, saw me yesterday, but I will reintroduce myself quickly for those that maybe didn't catch the session. And first, I'm on Zoom. AJ Bird, I have my company, Bird and McCrimmon. We are 100% Denny entrepreneur owned. We work in project development for clean technology. I was very interested in the AI conversation. I actually had a budding partnership. It's under development, the AI energy optimization company, which can bring solutions to an very ineffective NWT electrical grid. We could do virtual power purchase agreements and bring about efficiency so that we stop wasting electricity. One of the reasons that I got involved in carbon markets was I was first involved in landfill gas. So when the conversation was happening today about methane, I was very interested in that as well. But what comes out of electricity and methane and carbon and nature-based solutions, there's something called carbon credits. And carbon credits, earlier speaker, she talked about, like, when you have a government involved in carbon credits, that is what we call a compliance market, okay? We can do Indigenous carbon credits can be adhering to a government-led compliance market, or they can be in the voluntary market. So a raise of hands, how many people understand carbon markets? Okay, so not the majority. So when we're talking a carbon credit, there's terms like carbon offsets, carbon credits. I'm going to just simplify and use carbon credits today. This is a international, multi-billion and predicted to be trillion-dollar market in 2030 going forward because of global climate change and the need to decarbonize. So this is huge business. It's not huge business here in Canada yet. I will bring you to a quick comment on BC actually has a BC atmospheric sharing agreement with BC First Nations. And in that, there's a project called the Great Air Rainforest Credit. So we do have an example here in Canada of Indigenous carbon credits, but they're not branded Indigenous carbon credits. They're just carbon credits. And I've actually just recently secured my second First Nation client from BC to go out and sell their carbon credits internationally. So to the comment earlier today about safeguards and we have to be careful, can we do that? It's already happening. So you got to kind of get out of this NWT patronizing. We got to protect Indigenous peoples. There's well-documented systems already in place. And if you don't know, then you need to start asking. And that's why I'm really, really glad to have been asked to speak here.
So the Ireland system.
There we go. Okay, so we're going down. Okay. So what I came up with, a bit like how the nature steward model is coming out, I've come up with an Indigenous carbon credit model. They're rare, they're valuable, and they're impactful. Why are they rare? There's not enough of them, right? So what's the problem with traditional carbon projects, which speaks to some of the concerns about them? They're not transparent. They are exploitative. And we hear about this global south being exploited by carbon projects. It's happening here in Canada too. It's happening in the United States. When we have an external party come in and they control the project, that is exploitative. Exploitation of Indigenous lands. It happened before with renewable energy. It's a great solution, but when you have non-Indigenous ownership of anything on Indigenous lands that is extractive, that is exploitative. So when we're talking about what's the minimal benefits when we have Indigenous peoples that are put into, and I mentioned this earlier in the other session, impact benefit agreements, they're not necessarily evil, but they're not transparent. I'm a band member, Denny Nikwai. My band has an IBA with diamond companies. I get a check for $300 a year, but I don't know wherever else goes on. I'm not allowed to know. That is confidential, and that is wrong. Carbon markets have been secretive and confidential, so we need to get past that. I've included this picture. This is my great grandmother holding my grandfather. Some of you may have seen this picture, Catherine Beaulieu Lafferty's. And you met yesterday, Danny Bolio. That's my cousin. He came up to me and said, Catherine Bolio Lafferty's our relative. So he said, hi, cousin. So I thought that was great. But I bring this up because this is a picture that's used quite a bit to talk about the fur trade and Indigenous peoples here in Canada. When we have Indigenous lands and resources and anything that comes off of it, and Indigenous peoples are the harvesters, they are very often not paid what something's worth. And we know that from the days of the fur trade. You've heard of things like Indigenous peoples being paid with beads and trinkets for furs that later turned into luxury items over in Europe. A beaver hat was a sign of the only reserved for the aristocracy or the royal people or royal family or the wealthy people in Britain. Those furs, that beaver pelt, came from Indigenous lands by Indigenous peoples doing the hard work, and they got paid very little, if nothing, compared to what the value became over in Europe. So that is an example of the fur trade is happening here in Canada. It's happening with carbon credits. Again, I bring back to the nature stewardship people. They've come up with a model that I believe is definitely proactive. Mine works in conjunction, either independently or in alignment beside them. So when we have, my slides are out of order here. So when we talk about the fur trade, I will use that analogy a bit because I think everybody that's in the NWT should have understood the history of the fur trade as it impacts Indigenous peoples. So I'm making an assumption here. If you work for the NWT government, you have this knowledge. Lack of transparency in carbon market fees or carbon market profits, that is a problem in carbon credits. It's not just a problem in the global south. It's a problem in any carbon credit that is not done in a direct purchase model. And so why I say that is there's people, go back to the fur trade. We had Indigenous peoples, they're harvesters. They sold their pelts to the fur trade post. After they left the fur trade post, we do not know how much money was transacted in between, how many times it was traded before it ended up as a final product in Europe. That happens in carbon time and time and time again. And unfortunately, projects that have Indigenous peoples and lands that were affected, they are not benefiting from that final trade. Speculative nature of current carbon markets. Buy low, sell high. What they mean by that is sell high as many times as you want because there's no restrictions on how many times a carbon credit is bought and sold. And that, again, like the fur trade economy, is exploitative. This is an Indigenous-led solution for the carbon market, and it ensures Indigenous majority ownership and control. Canada Council for Indigenous Business, Canadian Aboriginal Minorities Supply Council, those are two independent certifying bodies here in Canada for if any company, carbon credit, could be a store, if they want to say they're an Indigenous business, they have to be independently certified, and their ownership documents, shareholder agreements, everything has to go forward. So there's no secret control. There has been some scandals of late, well-deserved, on Indigenous procurement. Unfortunately, the federal government has taken some hits on that at parliamentary hearings in the past, 3 to 4 months, and I encourage you to look into that. But there are certifying bodies that can prevent that from happening. And we can do this with carbon projects. What does that mean? Majority ownership and partnerships opportunities. Indigenous majority ownership is not just about who's front-facing and, we're on Indigenous lands and we say it's a partnership. No. Indigenous companies must be independently certified to be 51% owned and controlled. Say there's a board of directors. Has to be a majority Indigenous control. You can't have secret shareholder agreements, and I've seen those. I know of them. They happen. But you're taking a presumption that 51% ownership and control makes whatever that business is Indigenous, and it's whatever products it sells are Indigenous. In this case, carbon credits. That's the safeguard that's in place, and the external safeguard in place is that certifying body, which carbon credit standard have certifying bodies called standards, called methodology, protocols. If you want to work within a standard, you have to adhere to their protocols, meaning their rules.
So we are client system.
So the role of project developer and financiers, and again, the nature steward model, love it. My model is in tandem with it, but I would look at this, that this is about dealing with project developers and financiers. Generally, they take control of a project. And they use the example that the Indigenous nation doesn't have the capacity. Perhaps not. But I learned, all of us grew up not walking, but we learned to walk. You have to start somewhere. And part of Indigenous ownership is making sure that there's capacity building within nations to do carbon projects. But the role of a carbon project developer, the financiers, is always the money, and the money always tries to control things. But when you're looking at a project developer, think of it a bit like we have an Indigenous carbon credit project. We'll use the analogy of an Indigenous carbon restaurant. Okay, they own the land. They're gonna finance to build that carbon restaurant, and they're gonna hire a chef that works for them to sell the Indigenous carbon credit meal. Okay, so we just put into a restaurant analogy. What we realize is the Indigenous nation can own the land, the building. They hire a chef, a project developer, to work with them, but they do not get 50% of the profits. The Indigenous nation owns 100% of any revenue that comes out of its restaurant. Why would a carbon project be any different? And they pay the project developer to do their job, which is to make the carbon credit meal. Okay? I need to not misunderstand what carbon project developers are. They work for the project. They don't outright own it. And if they say they do or they think they do, I say, let's go find another carbon project chef, because you're the wrong ones. And I know that there's some great project developers out there. So the importance of ethical standards in carbon projects. We want to make sure that the exploitation of Indigenous peoples and their lands, and guess what, it even now includes waters. The Mi'kmaq presentation is to do. The Peace and Friendship Treaty actually extends out into the water, okay? Indigenous people in the NWT, we had to deal with the government all the time, even when it comes to the Great Slave Lake, for example. There was these external protocols and external rules that we have to adhere to. But at the end of the day, Indigenous territories includes waters. And when we're looking at carbon removal projects, which is a carbon project, it's just a special type of carbon process. When we're doing that, and it's now happening out in oceans and in kelp beds and places like that, this is not just land. We got to think about everything that we know about carbon projects. So one of the other solutions is a direct sale to end buyers. So when an Indigenous carbon credit is created, okay, it's certified, it's Indigenous majority owned, 51%, which means that allows a 49% partner position, or it could be 100% Indigenous owned, or any percentage in between 51 to 100. But when they go to sell, they can not sell to the middleman, the trading. They can turn around and they can say, no, we're only going to sell to somebody that wants to buy them to retire them. In other words, we're going to sell that fur pelt directly to the person that's going to wear that beaver hat, so that beaver pelt cannot be bought and sold time and time again. Okay? We are going to maximize the Indigenous carbon credit for our revenue and not allow the middleman to buy and sell it in secret countless times for untold profits. There's examples of direct purchase, and if anybody's watching carbon markets, I work internationally in carbon markets. I work with Indigenous projects down in South America. I have the BC carbon credit from the Great Bear Rainforest that are asking me to sell direct to buyers. So I'm actually selling, and it's quite ironically, in Europe. That's who wants these Indigenous carbon credits. So the same people that wanted the fur pelts, they want these carbon credits. Why? Because they're rare and they're ethical. So benefits: equity, transparency, maximum value, benefiting Indigenous nations while they do the hard work of addressing the climate crisis, which has come about since the time of industrialization. Who industrialized the Western world? Started from Europe. Followed the validity and verification of credits. I apologize, I'm speaking out of order here. But we talked about this earlier. External carbon standards, protocols. Basically, rule books that people have to adhere to. BC has, I mentioned earlier, the Atmospheric Benefit Sharing Agreement with BC First Nations. Is this something the NWT could consider? I would definitely recommend that there be consultations on what to do better from a First Nations perspective. But nevertheless, there are processes right now that are in play that can happen and happen well. And when we're looking at validity and verification, that's basically making sure that whatever the claim this carbon project is, it's been independently validated and verified. It's validated that it is definitely a real carbon credit that has not been, overestimated or underestimated, or, it's been calculated properly and it's verified independently as a valid carbon credit. So I break to the I mentioned you rare. Why are Indigenous carbon credits rare? Because there's very few of them in the world that are either at least 51% Indigenous owned. There's a lot of carbon credits out there that they say, oh, we work with Indigenous people. Oh, red flag for me. I'm a former cop. Oh my God, what do? I dive in. I check and see who owns this project. And then I go to the project details, the PDD docs online. And I look and I see, and there's a little check mark. Oh, we work with Indigenous people. We give them benefits. A bit of a hallmark back to the impact benefit agreements that are very secretive. Well, what's your benefit? Oh, I've seen things as insulting as lunch programs. People are making millions of dollars off of Indigenous lands, and they think that they can claim Indigenous benefits by a lunch program. What does that mean? Beads and trinkets all over again. So we've got to start asking questions. But back to why these are ethical and rare. They're ethical because they're not exploitative. Indigenous people own them. Majority own them. They can partner with people that can outright 100% own any carbon projects on their lands. Why I use the diamond comparison, especially relevant here in the Northwest Territories.
I don't know.
And I'm wearing a bunch of diamonds right now. And I can guarantee you the diamonds that are on my wrist and on my finger were not $300 a year. Or $300. My band, we get $300 a year per band member for diamond mines that operate, or a diamond mine that operates that we have an IBA with. And who's getting the real money from the diamonds is not the Indigenous people. And unfortunately, this is happening again in carbon credits. When we look at diamonds as well, there's 4 ways that, that people talk about the 4 C's of diamonds. There's another one that we can have. It's called ethical diamonds. What's the opposite of ethical diamonds? Conflict diamonds, blood diamonds, okay? There's blood carbon, there's conflict carbon out there right now. So when it's Indigenous owned with transparency and benefits to the Indigenous peoples, that is ethical and it is more rare, meaning it's more valuable, just like how a more rare diamond is valuable. So this leads to the opportunities for reconciliation and procurement. Again, I mentioned that there's robust European markets purchasing of carbon credits. There's a lot of people in Canada that will look at what the trading people are trading carbon for. It's not transparent. This is an opportunity to buy direct from Indigenous companies that are carbon credit producers, and achieve reconciliation, achieve climate solutions, and do Indigenous procurement, which is badly needed across all levels of government here in Canada. And I would obviously see down in the U.S., but the U.S. is definitely going through some crummy gains right now. So we can do better here in Canada, and we can lead the way. And working for Indigenous nations, part of my work is that I represent nations that want to work in carbon projects, and I help them find the right project developer to work with. Or when they're working with the project developer, I can let the project developer do their work, like never back, like the chef analogy, and I can go out and help the Indigenous nation with the other ownership responsibilities of owning a carbon credit restaurant, right? And so we need to have these type of solutions brought forward and stop thinking that we can make decisions for Indigenous nations. They run very successful businesses now. And then there's some pushback on should carbon credit business be part of our climate solutions? Yes, it should be. We need all barrels blazing right now to combat climate change. And there's definitely very effective nature-based solution, emission reduction, carbon credit. I talked about the carbon removals with biochar to decarbonize changing fuels and getting low carbon fuel credits. This is the world. So the NWT, as much as you might be hesitant and worried, it's time to start looking outside the NWT borders for what's worked and change what hasn't worked and do it better here in the NWT. Thank you.